Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take a monumental stack of sources, distill the core truths, and hand you the intellectual shortcuts.
And today we are wading into, well, an ocean of history, spirituality, and some relentless geopolitics.
We're talking about the Dalai Lama.
It's truly one of the most complex titles in global history. I mean, the person holding it is required to juggle this profound, almost divine spiritual mandate with the stark, often brutal realities of secular political power.
Right. For most Western listeners, the Dalai Lama is Tenzin Gyatso, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, the global voice of compassion in exile.
Sure. But if you look at the entire 600-year lineage, you are looking at figures who were quite literally both high spiritual masters and temporal kings.
That contradiction is exactly what makes this deep dive so essential. Let's unpack the title itself, because even the name, the full formal title, tells this incredible fusion story.
It really does. It's Holiness Knowing Everything, Vajradhara Dalai Lama.
Yep.
It's a masterful fusion of, Mongolic, Tibetan, and Sanskrit terms, and it really encapsulates the history of the whole institution.
So break that down for us.
So the core name comes from two distinct languages. You have Dalai, which is the Mongolic word for ocean.
An ocean, right. Which I think is a translation of the Tibetan word gyatso.
Exactly, Gyatso. You see it in so many of their names. And then Lama is the Tibetan part.
Meaning master or guru.
Right. So this name, Ocean Master, it was first offered as a sign of respect and really of alliance.
To whom?
To the leader of the Gelug school at the time, Sonam Gyatso, by the mighty Mongol chieftain Altan Khan. This was way back in 1578.
So the name wasn't born in a temple, it was born in a political treaty.
Precisely. You have the geopolitics baked right into the name from the very beginning.
But the spiritual core, the identity that, supersedes any political title, that's Avalokiteśvara.
Absolutely. According to the foundational doctrine of Tibetan Buddhism, the Dalai Lama isn't just a high-ranking monk. They are revered as the specific manifestation of Avalokiteśvara, the bodhisattva of compassion.
And for anyone listening who might not be familiar with that term, a bodhisattva is?
A bodhisattva is a realized being, someone who has achieved enlightenment, but instead of stepping into final nirvana, has taken this incredibly solemn vow.
The bodhisattva vow.
Yes, a vow to be perpetually reborn into the world to alleviate suffering and help all living beings reach enlightenment themselves. This is the absolute bedrock of the spiritual legitimacy and moral authority the lineage has.
And then you have the political half, the temporal power, which just contrasts so sharply with that spiritual bedrock.
It really began in earnest in the 17th century. From 1642 until the final Chinese takeover in 1951, the Dalai Lamas, or, very frequently their regents.
The Kalans, right, chief ministers.
Exactly. They led the entire secular government of Tibet. This system was called the Ganden Phodrang government, and it ruled from the Potala Palace in Lhasa.
So the tension is constant.
Constant. How does the reincarnation of pure, infinite compassion manage taxation, maintain military alliances, administer justice, and navigate the complex, often violent world of international relations?
A world that, for the 14th incarnation, Tenzin Gyatso, culminated in exile.
Absolutely. The current reality is entirely defined by that exile. Tenzin Gyatso has resided in Dharamshala, India, since he fled Lhasa in March 1959.
Which was right after the failed Tibetan uprising against the encroaching Chinese government.
That's right.
So our mission in this deep dive is to trace the history of this dramatic lineage, the 14 recognized incarnations. We want to explore how political power, these crucial foreign alliances with the Mongols and the Qing dynasty, and now the current intense crisis of succession, have shaped and really tested the very foundations of the institution.
We're going to see how a spiritual master became a king, how that kingdom fell apart, and how the current Lama is fighting to ensure the line survives the modern nation state.
Okay, let's unpack the incredible depth of this lineage. Because the story, it doesn't just start in the 15th century with the first recognized Dalai Lama. It starts in myth, spanning millennia.
And that continuity is just so central to the Tibetan view of the world. For the followers, the lineage of the Dalai Lama stretches back far, far beyond the Gelug school.
How far back are we talking?
According to the office of the 14th Dalai Lama, he is considered the 74th in a continuous line of incarnations.
74th.
Yes, tracing all the way back to a Brahmin boy who was a contemporary of Buddha Shakyamuni about 2,500 years ago.
That number alone, 74, it just conveys this idea of an unbroken cosmic mandate. So what are some of the major recognizable historical milestones in that that mythical pre-formal lineage?
Well, the belief structure holds that Avalokiteśvara intervenes in Tibet's fate. He periodically incarnates as benevolent rulers and teachers whenever the country is in crisis or needs spiritual guidance.
Like who?
The most notable pre-Gelug historical figures they cite would be the towering King Songtsen Gampo in the 7th century. He's credited with introducing Buddhism to Tibet and founding the first major monasteries.
Okay.
And then later you have Drom Tumpa in the 11th century. He was instrumental in the second wave of Buddhist propagation and the establishment of the Kadam school.
So this rich history, which you find in texts like the Book of Kadam, it basically laid the philosophical groundwork.
It laid the essential groundwork for later generations to identify the Gelug leaders as manifestations of the bodhisattva of compassion. It just made the acceptance of the tulku system, the reincarnation system, much easier once it was formalized.
So this institutionalization, the formal process, it wasn't a fluke. It was the culmination of Avalokiteshvara's promised master plan to guide and defend Tibet. And that plan began with the founder of the Guild School.
That's right. The first critical stage involved Jet Tsongkhapa. He was the great 14th century reformer and founder of the Gelug school, which, people often call the Yellow Hat School.
Because of the ceremonial hats worn by the monks.
Exactly. Before his death in 1419, Tsongkhapa established the 3 great monastic universities around Lhasa, Drepung, Ganden, and Sera. And these weren't just monasteries.
No, they were massive, sophisticated institutions.
Right. They quickly became the intellectual and political pillars of Gelug power, really laying the foundation for their future dominance.
And Tsongkhapa's disciple, Ganden Phodrang, he became the first recognized figure in the actual lineage. He's posthumously titled the first Dalai Lama.
Ganden Phodrang, who lived from 1391 to 1474, was just a brilliant scholar. He became the abbot of Drepung, which then grew into the largest of the Gelugpa monasteries. But his political foresight was remarkable.
In what way?
He realized the Gelug school couldn't just remain confined to the Lhasa region if it wanted to compete with the older, more established orders like the Karma Kagyu.
So he undertook a crucial expansion.
He founded the Tashilhunpo monastery at Shigatse.
Wait, Tashilhunpo was founded in Sang, which was deep in rival Karma Kagyu territory. How significant was that move?
Oh, hugely significant. It was a strategic masterstroke. It extended Gelug influence outward from central Tibet and established a major permanent presence in Sang province.
And Tashilhunpo would, of course, later become the traditional seat of the Panchen Lamas.
The second highest spiritual authority. So it established a key geographical anchor and was a clear statement that the Gelugpa were a nationwide force, not just a Lhasa phenomenon.
But I understand that initially the Gelug school actually avoided the tulku system, the idea of successive reincarnations, which the older schools all followed. Why the resistance?
Well, the initial resistance was really rooted in Tsongkhapa's focus on academic rigor and meritocracy.
So it was all about study and discipline.
Right. The Gelug school prioritized philosophical study and monastic discipline above all else. Adopting the tulku system, where leadership is based on a divine stream of successive rebirths rather than purely merit, it sort of felt like a compromise to their intellectual roots.
So who engineered the shift?
That was the second Dalai Lama, Gendun Gyatso, who lived from 1475 to 1542. He was the one who engineered that shift.
How revolutionary was that for the Gelugpa, given their previous adherence to merit?
It was absolutely revolutionary because Gendun Gyatso successfully persuaded the Gelugpa leadership to adopt the tulku system. This aligned them with the tradition of spiritual continuity that had been established by the older schools.
Which was crucial for institutional survival.
Absolutely. It solidified the idea that their leadership was divinely sanctioned and perpetual, which gave them a spiritual gravitas that, appointment by merit just couldn't match in a deeply religious society.
And the second Lama didn't just adopt the system. He actually created the practical ritual mechanism for finding his successors, which is still used today.
And that's where the ritual component, the indispensable element of the search process, really enters the picture. Gendun Gyatso traveled to southern Tibet and established the Chokurgyal Monastery near the sacred Lama Lotso Lake.
And he empowered the lake.
He literally empowered the lake, establishing the tradition that high lamas seeking the next incarnation would meditate by its shores. And there they would receive prophetic visions that reveal clues, often letters, geographic features, or specific people that would be used to locate the next rebirth.
And this is still the method.
Every Dalai Lama since the third has been found with the help of those visions. It makes the selection process entirely internal and crucially spiritually verifiable.
So by the middle of the 16th century, the spiritual infrastructure is fully established. You've got the great monasteries, the tulku system, and the ritual selection method. Now we hit the political catalyst. The third Dalai Lama, Sonam Gyatso.
Sonam Gyatso, who lived from 1543 to 1588, was a powerful figure from the start. He came from a noble family, which gave him significant political leverage early on. He wasn't just a scholar, he was a statesman.
What did he do?
He successfully mediated vicious fighting between warring factions in Lhasa, and he organized flood relief efforts. He was positioning himself clearly as a national leader capable of secular governance.
But the truly pivotal moment came in 1578.
The pivotal meeting with Altan Khan.
What was the risk for Sonam Gyatso in traveling to Mongolia? And what did he get in return that was worth that political gamble?
The risk was enormous. I mean, traveling deep into the territory of nomadic warriors who had historically been antagonistic to Tibet was incredibly dangerous. But the reward was the key to Gelug ascendancy.
Altan Khan, the powerful chief of the Tumid Mongol tribes, he had invited him repeatedly.
He had. And the result of that 1578 meeting was the conversion of the entire Mongol nation to Gelug Buddhism.
That is just immense. It transforms the Gelugpa from a powerful regional force into an international spiritual power.
Exactly. It gave the Gelugpa a vast spiritual empire that spanned most of Central Asia. And crucially, it secured them an unshakable, powerful military protector, the Mongol nation.
And in gratitude.
In gratitude for this spiritual guidance, Altan Khan bestowed the title Dalai Lama upon Sonam Gyatso and, retroactively, upon the first two incarnations as well. This formalization of the name solidified a spiritual lineage wrapped in a profound and, well, a necessary political alliance. The Gelug school had found its patron.
The stage is now set for the era of temporal rule. The spiritual master now has access to a military hammer. But before we get to the Great Fifth, we have the fourth Dalai Lama, Altan Gyatso, who was highly unique and critical for strengthening that Mongol connection.
He was, in fact, a Mongol.
Right.
Altan Gyatso was the great-grandson of the very man who bestowed the title Altan Khan. This was completely unprecedented.
I can imagine that move massively cemented the Gelugpa's foreign patronage.
It did. And it was arguably essential for their continued survival against rival Tibetan factions. But it also intensified internal opposition. The rival Karma Kagyu school and the Sangpa dynasty, who controlled Shigatse, they saw the Gelugpa as increasingly beholden to foreign, non-Tibetan powers.
So the Gelug school had the spiritual legitimacy and the foreign patrons, but internal political opposition intensified to a point where outright military conflict became inevitable.
Yes, and this brings us to the political genius who finally unified Tibet. The fifth Dalai Lama, Ngong Lobsang Gyatso, he's often referred to as the Great Fifth.
The Great Fifth.
The fifth Dalai Lama is rightly revered as the most politically astute figure in the lineage. He oversaw the unification, but the key military strategy, the one that delivered temporal power, was orchestrated by his manager, a man named Sonam Rabten.
Okay, so what happened?
After the fourth Lama's death, open conflict erupted. Sonam Rabten, seeing the existential threat posed by the Sangpa king, secretly identified the new incarnation and then actively sought the decisive military assistance of the Koshit Mongol chieftain, Gushi Khan.
So this was the military hammer that finally unified Tibet. What was the scope of Gushi Khan's conquest?
The conquest was absolute. By 1642, Gushi Khan's forces had militarily defeated all Gelugpa rivals. This included the entire Tsampa dynasty, the powerful Karmapas, and their Bonpo allies in Kham. It was a decisive end to centuries of fragmentation.
And
Gushi Khan then conferred full sovereignty on the fifth Dalai Lama. This established the Ganden Phodrang government out of Lhasa and unified Tibet under a central religious authority for the first time in over 8 centuries. It marked the moment the Dalai Lama became king.
wait, the unification sounds entirely political and violent. Did the fifth Lama reconcile his spiritual mandate of compassion with the military actions taken in his name?
And this is where we hit that incredible internal contradiction. The sources, including the fifth Lama's own writings, reveal a deep moral discomfort with it all.
Really?
Yes. While his manager, Sonam Rabten, was actively pushing for total military victory, the Dalai Lama himself, out of conscience and compassion, had explicitly refused to give permission for more warfare after the initial defeat of the Berry King.
So the attack on the Sangpa dynasty was orchestrated by Rabten, who went behind his master's back.
He did. For this blatant defiance, the fifth Dalai Lama is recorded as having severely rebuked his own manager. Yet he was the ultimate beneficiary of the resulting temporal power.
He became a sovereign king against his own moral objections. This political arrangement, which lasted for centuries, is defined by the Makad-Yan relationship, or the priest and patron concept. We really need to define that clearly.
Okay, the Makad-Yan relationship is absolutely fundamental to understanding Central Asian power dynamics. Makad refers to the one who receives offerings, the spiritual priest, the Lama, and Yan refers to the one who makes the offering, the secular patron, the Khan, or emperor.
The patron offered political and military protection.
And material resources, yes. While the Lama provides spiritual guidance, vital religious legitimacy, and moral instruction.
Proponents, especially the Tibetans, argued this structure allowed Tibet a degree of autonomy in cultural and internal affairs, while ensuring the state's stability under the protection of a powerful military.
Right, that's the argument.
But critics, particularly outside observers and historians, argue this framework was often just a cloak for external dominance.
That's the modern criticism, yes. Historians contend it was a diplomatic fiction that obscured the true political dominance of the stronger state. Melvin Goldstein, a prominent historian of Tibet, described Tibet under this system as essentially a vassal state or tributary, subject to external control, particularly once the Qing dynasty established firm control in the 18th century.
The idea of patron shifts easily into master when the patron holds all the military power.
Exactly.
Speaking of the king, the fifth Dalai Lama's engagement with the new Manchu-led dynasty after they defeated the Mongols was a complex, high-stakes diplomatic maneuver. Tell us about his 1653 visit to the Shunzi emperor in Beijing.
That visit was a masterclass in diplomatic theater. The king saw the Dalai Lamas travel to Beijing as nominal political submission. I mean, they argued that major Asian heads of state didn't travel that distance unless they were acknowledging some degree of hierarchy.
But a fifth Dalai Lama maintained immense personal and spiritual dignity.
He did. Accounts describe the emperor advancing 30 feet from his throne to greet him, a major symbolic gesture of respect between two equals, or at least two powers acknowledging each other's separate spheres of influence.
But the real proof of his uncompromising desire for autonomy lies in what he did upon his return to Lhasa regarding the gifts he received.
It's a fantastic anecdote that demonstrates sovereignty. The emperor had given him a golden seal of authority, symbolizing his recognition.
Okay.
But the Dalai Lama recorded in his autobiography, Dukula, that the Tibetan translation on the seal was poor, and he felt the inscription was designed to patronize him, implying a subordinate relationship.
So what did he do?
So he publicly discarded the imperial seal and carved a new one for state usage, declaring an independent political usage for it. That was a clear, unambiguous assertion that his authority derived from spiritual legitimacy, not from the king-emperor.
And his political ambitions didn't end with his life. We have to discuss the great secret.
This is one of the most astonishing political deceptions in history. When the fifth Dalai Lama died in 1682, his powerful regent, Desi Sanjay Gyatso, made the audacious, almost unbelievable decision to completely hide his death for 15 years.
15 years. Until 1697. I mean, how did the regent justify the leader of a centralized state being in strict meditation retreat for 15 years? That's not just diplomacy, that's theater.
It was immense, protracted statecraft. The regent claimed the Dalai Lama was in a strict, lifelong meditation retreat and continued to rule Tibet entirely on his behalf, supposedly receiving spiritual guidance via secret channels.
What were the motivations?
The two primary motivations were intensely practical. First, to finish the construction of the massive Potala Palace, a symbol of unified Tibetan power without any interference. And second, to prevent political chaos or invasion from Tibet's neighbors, particularly the restless Mongols and the increasingly interested king.
Because a succession crisis, especially involving a child Lama, would have immediately invited foreign intervention.
Immediately.
But that level of secrecy is impossible to maintain indefinitely.
It was an unsustainable lie. The deception was eventually revealed, partially through the regent's own attempts to secure the succession, and partially through external spies. This led directly to intense political unrest.
And the regent, Desi Sanjay Gyatso, was later killed.
Yes, in 1705 by Altan Khan, the chieftain of the Koshit Mongols, who was acting partly with the support of the Kanki emperor. The emperor was furious that the Desi had not reported the fifth's death years earlier.
And the fallout from the Great Secret just dragged the Qing dynasty fully into Tibetan affairs.
It set the stage for a century of severe instability.
Following that explosive crisis surrounding the Great Fifth's death, the 18th century began with intense external power struggles involving the next two lamas, marking a major erosion of Tibetan autonomy.
Absolutely. And the sixth Dalai Lama, Sangye Gyatso, is famous for being the most unconventional in the lineage, openly rejecting the monastic life.
Indeed, he was discovered and selected by the regent, but upon coming of age, he rejected full ordination in 1702.
Right. He preferred the life of a layman, indulging in wine, poetry, and these famous romantic escapades in Lhasa. He was wildly popular with the people, but politically, he was unstable.
Which provided the perfect political excuse for Altan Khan, the Mongol ruler installed by the king, to seize full control.
The perfect excuse. Altan Khan deposed and arrested the popular sixth Lama in 1706, and he died mysteriously en route to Beijing at age 24.
And then Altan Khan tried to install a puppet Dalai Lama, which was a massive mistake.
It backfired completely. He tried to install a man named Yeshe Gyatso with the forced endorsement of the Panchen Lama, but the Tibetan people, the monasteries, and rival Mongol groups, they universally rejected this pretender Lama.
And this instability, this power vacuum, it was exploited by the Dzungar Mongols.
Yes, who invaded Lhasa in 1717, ostensibly to remove the unpopular Altan Khan and his puppet.
And that Dzungar invasion opened the door for the Qing dynasty to truly establish their dominance. They stepped in as liberators.
They absolutely did. The Dzungar invasion turned into this bloody, destructive rampage. And the Tibetan people, in despair, actually begged the King Emperor Kangxi for help.
So the king sent a massive expeditionary force.
A massive force, bringing the young boy recognized as the legitimate reincarnation, the seventh Dalai Lama, Kelsang Gyatso, with them. By 1720, the Dzungars were expelled, and the seventh Dalai Lama was enthroned at the Potala Palace.
But his position was immediately compromised, wasn't it?
Entirely. Having vanquished the Mongols, the king had absolutely no intention of leaving. They installed the Ambans, their imperial representatives, and a permanent military garrison.
So Kelsang Gyatso was initially just reduced to a political figurehead?
Yes, the king, concerned about any resurgence of the Dalai Lama's temporal power, heavily restricted his influence. And that restriction led to further intervention.
How so?
The seventh Lama's father had supported an anti-king faction after the liberation, leading to more political upheaval. As punishment for his family's actions, Kelsang Gyatso was exiled to Kham for 7 years in 1728.
When was he restored to power?
He was only eventually restored to temporal power in 1751 after an anti-king ruler was assassinated, and the seventh Dalai Lama demonstrated clear, absolute loyalty during the subsequent chaos.
And this reestablished system?
The Dalai Lama presiding over a government administered by the Kashag, or the Tibetan cabinet, is the governing structure that essentially lasted until the 1950s.
So the seventh Lama finally restores a stable governing structure, but then we enter the devastating 19th century, characterized by this unprecedented and tragic pattern of short-lived lamas.
It is the darkest period of instability for the institution, without a doubt. The 9th through the 12th Dalai Lamas all died before or just after assuming full power.
What were their ages?
To be specific, Lumtok Gyatso died at age 9, Tsoltrim Gyatso at 21, Kedrub Gyatso at 17, and Trinley Gyatso at 18.
So for 113 consecutive years, from 1804 to 1913, Tibet was primarily ruled by a succession of powerful regents,
which gave the King Ambans enormous latitude to interfere.
This pattern cannot be a coincidence. The source material presents 3 conflicting theories about why these lamas kept dying young. Let's start with the one rooted in Tibetan suspicion theory A.
Okay, theory A, often voiced by traditionalists, suggests deliberate foul play, specifically poisoning.
Who voiced this?
The 14th Dalai Lama's elder brother, Thopt Injigmi Norbu, voiced this suspicion very clearly. The argument is that a mature, capable Dalai Lama was seen as a direct threat to centralized control, either by powerful, ambitious Tibetan figures or by the king.
And the deaths frequently occurred just as the Lama reached an age where he might assume full political power.
Exactly. Norbu specifically noted that these deaths often occurred shortly after the Lama's ritual visits to the sacred Lamo Lotso Lake, implying that the selection process was monitored and the new Lama was neutralized before he could become a national force.
So the argument is either Chinese officials sought a more manageable, pliable ruler, or Tibetan officials feared these Lamas were Chinese-appointed imposters. But the counter theory, theory B, places the blame elsewhere.
Theory B, which is favored by many Western historians like Hugh Richardson, suggests that the primary cause was internal treachery rooted in greed.
not the king.
Richardson argued it wasn't necessarily the king and bands pulling the strings, but rather the ambition and greed for power of Tibetans themselves. The regents and high nobles benefited enormously from a prolonged period of tutelage where they maintained supreme, unchecked authority while the Dalai Lama was a minor.
That makes a tragic kind of political sense. If the regents were successful in killing the lamas, they could prolong their own time in power. A long-lived, effective Dalai Lama would immediately curb their power and wealth.
Exactly. And this theory suggests the king ambans, after an initial period of zeal following the 1751 crisis, often became lax, less effective, and sometimes openly corrupt in Lhasa. They just allowed the local power struggles to fester, which benefited the longest-serving Tibetan regents.
And what about the final, more spiritual explanation offered by the current Dalai Lama, Theory C?
Tenzin Gyatso offers a more nuanced, maybe fatalistic view. He has publicly doubted the theory of deliberate poisoning, attributing these deaths to sheer negligence, a lack of sophisticated medical care in 19th century Tibet, or simply poor collective karma from the world itself manifesting in instability.
But that view is challenged by other Tibetan historians.
It is. K. Dondup directly contradicted the idea that strong lamas served king interests, arguing that the Manchu goal was to perpetuate domination, and therefore, he said, they did not desire a Dalai Lama who will ascend the throne and become a strong and capable ruler.
The fact that the 13th Dalai Lama finally lived long enough to declare independence is cited as proof of this threat.
Precisely.
The overwhelming consequence of this era of short-lived lamas, regardless of the cause, was the severe weakening of the central state, making it highly vulnerable to foreign aggression, which would, of course, explode in the 20th century.
These repeated cycles of short-lived lamas and long regencies meant the burden of restoring Tibetan sovereignty and internal strength fell squarely upon the shoulders of the two modern Dalai Lamas, the 13th and the current 14th.
The 13th Dalai Lama, Thupten Gyatso, truly modernized himself through crisis and exile, didn't he?
He did. Thupten Gyatso was the first Lama in over a century to reach maturity and assume full temporal power. He gained critical geopolitical knowledge through a series of forced displacements that few previous lamas ever experienced.
He had to flee Lhasa twice.
First in 1904, escaping the invasion of Tibet by the British Expeditionary Force under Francis Younghusband, and then again from 1910 to 1912, escaping a massive Chinese invasion launched by the collapsing Qing dynasty.
How did those years in exile in Mongolia, and particularly in British India, change his perspective?
They gave him an unvarnished, immediate understanding of international politics and modern military capabilities. He saw firsthand the structure of modern armies, the workings of telegraphs, the importance of organized statecraft.
So when he returned from exile in India, he was a different man.
A completely different leader. He took direct control of foreign relations, dealing with British and Nepalese officials himself, rather than relying on his court officials. He was determined that Tibet would not be a geopolitical pawn any longer.
And upon the collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1912, he immediately asserted Tibet's new status.
In 1913, following his return to Lhasa, the 13th Dalai Lama published the Tibetan Declaration of Independence. This was a clear political break.
A break that China never recognized.
Never. China, under its various Republican and later communist governments, always insisted they inherited sovereignty over all former Qing territories, but the declaration had real international weight.
For example,
the Kingdom of Nepal officially listed Tibet as an independent and sovereign reference when submitting its application to join the United Nations in 1949.
Beyond just sovereignty, he was a massive domestic reformer. You mentioned he tried to abolish the death penalty and introduce a modern police force. How successful were these reforms?
His reforms were sweeping, but faced significant internal resistance, particularly from conservative elements within the major monasteries and the entrenched nobility who benefited from the old feudal system.
What did he achieve?
He initiated judicial reforms, abolishing the death penalty and introducing an independent police force in Lhasa trained in modern methods, a stark contrast to the old system. Crucially, he tried to curb the excessive demands made on peasants by the monasteries and the lay nobility, limiting tax burdens and compulsory labor.
That must have been fiercely unpopular with the religious and political elite.
It was. He was essentially trying to transform a medieval theocratic state into a modern, centralized government capable of defending itself. He introduced secular education alongside monastic training and even supervised the installation of the first limited electricity and telegraph systems in Lhasa in the 1920s.
His goal was clear. Internal strength was the only defense against external aggression.
Exactly. He famously warned Tibetans before his death that disaster would strike if they failed to modernize, saying they must adopt a resolute policy to resist external aggression.
Unfortunately, his successor, the 14th Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso, faced that disaster head-on with the rise of the People's Republic of China. Tell us about his discovery and youth.
Tenzin Gyatso was born Lama Thondup in 1935 in Taksar, a remote village in the Amdo province of northeastern Tibet. The story of his discovery is remarkable. He was born into a simple farmer's family, literally on a straw mat in a cowshed.
And he was one of 16 children.
One of 16, and 3 of his siblings were later recognized as high reincarnate lamas, or rinpoches, an unprecedented concentration of spiritual figures in one family.
And crucially, his selection process managed to bypass the king-established golden urn system.
It did. Though the king were technically gone, Beijing was watching. His recognition and enthronement in 1940 were approved by the central government of the Republic of China at the time, which saw this as an assertion of their traditional oversight.
But the discovery itself was traditional.
It was. The regions followed the visions at Lamo Lotso Lake, located the specific house, and the young boy correctly identified items belonging to the 13th Dalai Lama, satisfying the traditional religious requirements.
That early history approved by the central government contrasts so sharply with the political tragedy that unfolded in 1951.
By 1950, the newly established People's Republic of China had invaded and occupied eastern Tibet. The young Dalai Lama, who had been enthroned early due to the crisis, was pressured into accepting the 17-point agreement for the peaceful liberation of Tibet in 1951.
This agreement formally incorporated the region into the PRC.
It did. He later publicly revoked this agreement in 1959, issuing a statement that the agreement was concluded under duress and was illegitimate.
And the immediate aftermath was his dramatic escape.
Yes, fearing for his life during the massive but ultimately doomed 1959 Tibetan uprising against Chinese rule, he fled across the Himalayas to India. There, he established the Central Tibetan Administration, the government in exile in Dharamshala.
And it's a crucial point of historical context that during the peak of the Cold War in the 1960s, the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency actively funded his administration.
With $1.7 million a year.
Wait, $1.7 million from the CIA. That's a massive injection of geopolitical intrigue into a spiritual exile. What was that funding specifically for?
The funding was part of a larger U.S. Cold War strategy aimed at containing communism and pressuring the PRC. It was intended primarily to support Tibetan guerrilla operations, the Chushi Gangdruk operating out of Nepal and Mustang against the Chinese.
That support must have been significant for the exile government's survival.
It was, though it was eventually cut off as U.S.-China relations began to thaw in the 1970s. But the fact that the spiritual leader of Tibetan Buddhism became a strategic Cold War asset just highlights the intense political environment he operated in.
How has his political stance evolved since then, particularly regarding the concept of independence?
He has performed a massive political shift. Initially, his goal was full independence, but he later shifted to seeking what he termed the middle way.
Which calls for genuine high-level autonomy for Tibet within the existing framework of the PRC.
Exactly. Since 2005, he has publicly agreed that Tibet is part of China, but he emphasizes that China must allow Tibet to preserve its unique culture, language, and script.
He even said in 2020 that he supports the concept of a republic within the People's Republic of China.
Yes, where ethnic minorities like Tibetans, Mongols, and Uyghurs could live in harmony. It suggests a move towards federalism rather than outright separation.
Beyond his formal political role, he has become a global moral figure, which has led to intense public scrutiny and some recent controversies. We must address these challenges to his public persona impartially.
We must. His transition from a temporal king to a global moral icon means he's judged by a different standard, a standard that is constantly changing. We see this contrast between his role as a respected moral voice and some statements that have garnered heavy criticism globally.
For example, the comments regarding refugees in Europe in 2018.
Yes. He stated publicly that Europe belongs to the Europeans. He suggested that while Europe had a moral obligation to provide temporary humanitarian aid to refugees whose lives were in peril, those refugees should ultimately return home to develop their native countries once stability was restored.
A viewpoint which was seen by many international observers as insensitive or politically charged.
Right. And then you have the comments regarding a potential female successor.
In 2019, he commented that a female Dalai Lama should be more attractive, because if she looked a certain way, people would prefer not see that face.
He later clarified his comments, suggesting they were intended as a playful, humorous remark. However, in the age of global media, such comments demonstrate the immense pressure and the lack of filter often applied to a figure who is simultaneously a traditional spiritual master and a modern, high-profile global personality.
In the most recent high-profile incident in 2023 involving a young boy in Dharamshala,
he faced intense public scrutiny for that incident. He issued a public apology, explaining that he often teases people he meets in an innocent and playful way, following a specific cultural tradition of interaction, but he expressed profound regret that his actions caused distress or misunderstanding in the modern public sphere.
So the 14th Dalai Lama is undeniably an engaged Buddhist with global appeal.
But his statements, especially since gaining an international audience and ceding his political authority to an elected parliament in 2001, have demonstrated that even a figure of his spiritual stature is now subject to constant public accountability.
All this history, the political genius of the 5th, the tragic fate of the short-lived lamas, the geopolitical battles of the 13th and 14th, now culminates in the single most critical challenge facing the institution: the conflict over succession.
And this is truly a battle for the soul and the future identity of the entire institution. There is an absolute deadlock between the traditional centuries-old Tibetan method of selection and the legalistic political claim of the People's Republic of China.
Let's start with Tibetan doctrine. How should his successor, the Yangzi, traditionally be chosen, and what is the current Lama's condition?
Tibetan doctrine dictates that the outgoing Lama holds the primary authority. He can choose or guide the choice of his reincarnation, the Yangzi. This often involves high lamas receiving clear portents, interpreting dreams, or consulting the state oracle after monitoring the direction of the smoke from the deceased lama's cremation.
And the 14th Dalai Lama has been extremely vocal and explicit about this.
Extremely. He insists that his successor must be found through these traditional spiritual means and should under no circumstances be subject to external political influence, particularly that of Beijing.
And what is the foundation of the PRC's claim they don't recognize the spiritual process?
No. The Chinese government claims the sole legal authority to oversee and approve all high reincarnations, including the Dalai Lama. They base this claim on historical precedent established during the Qing dynasty.
Specifically the Golden Urn system.
Right, which was formalized in 1793 by the Qianlong Emperor.
We need to clearly define the Golden Urn system. What was it, and why was it introduced?
It was a political mechanism disguised as a religious one. It required the names of leading candidate boys for high reincarnations to be written on slips, wrapped in barley clumps, and then randomly drawn from a golden urn.
And the king introduced this system explicitly to curb the growing influence and corruption of powerful Tibetan noble families who often tried to ensure their sons were selected.
Exactly, and also to limit the power of external patrons like the Mongols.
Was the golden urn widely used?
It was used a few times for the Dalai Lama during the instability of the 19th century, including the 10th, 11th, and 12th Lamas, though historians dispute how random the draw really was.
But Tibetan authorities strongly resisted its use for the 13th and 14th Dalai Lamas.
They did, successfully insisting on traditional methods. It essentially fell into disuse. Today, however, Chinese authorities point to the historical existence of the Golden Urn system as their legal right to oversee and approve the selection process under the claim of sovereign jurisdiction.
We don't have to look to history for Chinese interference. We have the clear modern example with the Panchen Lama, which serves as a definitive foreshadowing.
The 1995 selection of the 11th Panchen Lama is the critical case study. The Panchen Lama is traditionally the second most important figure in Tibetan Buddhism and holds the spiritual duty to recognize the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama.
And in 1995, the 14th Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso, recognized a 6-year-old boy named Gedhun Choki Nyima as the true 11th Panchen Lama.
He did, following visions at Lama Lotso.
And what was the immediate strategic response from Beijing?
The Chinese government immediately rejected this choice. Within days, the boy, Gedhun Choki Nyima, was abducted by Chinese state security.
He has not been seen in public since 1995.
No, it makes him potentially the world's youngest political prisoner. Beijing then installed their own rival candidate, Gankin Norbu, through their own manipulated Golden Urn process.
That is a clear, deliberate, strategic maneuver by the PRC. If they control the Panchen Lama, they control the spiritual figure who must approve the Dalai Lama's successor.
Absolutely. It ensures a politically loyal individual is in position to grant the legitimacy required for the next Dalai Lama, thus securing Chinese control over both the spiritual and political succession.
What's the Tibetan response to that?
Tashi Wangdi, the Dalai Lama's representative in London, has publicly dismissed this potential Chinese-backed choice as meaningless. He noted that you can't impose an archbishop or a spiritual saint. The choice has to be a decision of the followers of that tradition.
And he pointed out that the Chinese-appointed Panchen Lama can't even be kept permanently in Tibet.
Because the people refuse to see him or acknowledge his authority.
So with this conflict intensifying and the 14th Dalai Lama advancing in age, what is his final plan to ensure the spiritual continuity of lineage outside of Chinese control?
He has been extremely proactive. Shortly before his 90th birthday, which he celebrated in July 2025, he released a very clear statement affirming the continuation of the institution, but detailing the procedure for his recognition.
And what does it say?
He confirmed that the Ganden Phodrang Trust, the historical institution that governed Tibet and now oversees the exile administration, will have the exclusive responsibility for recognizing his successor. He explicitly states that no one, especially political bodies, has the authority to interfere.
And this succession choice isn't just a two-party conflict between Tibetans in exile and the PRC. It involves regional powers.
Oh, it has major global and regional implications, particularly involving Mongolia. Mongolia maintains strong cultural and religious ties to Tibetan Buddhism, dating back to Altan Khan.
And the Jebsen Damba Kutuktu is the third most important figure.
The third most important in the Gelug hierarchy, and he traditionally plays a significant role in the recognition process. If the next Dalai Lama were to be found in Mongolia, it would solidify a powerful anti-Beijing religious and political alliance, directly affecting regional stability in Inner Asia.
Ultimately, the 14th Dalai Lama has laid down a clear, personal ultimatum regarding where he will and will not be reborn.
His final statement is perhaps the most forceful political act of his later life. He has stated, unequivocally, that he will not be reborn in a country controlled by the PRC, or in any country that is not free.
Which strongly suggests that the next incarnation may come from the Tibetan cultural belt outside China.
Places like Ladakh in India, Nepal, or Bhutan. This would make the next Dalai Lama, by birthplace, potentially even more pro-Indian and anti-Chinese in the eyes of Beijing. The search will literally become a matter of geopolitical intelligence and border patrol.
If we look back across the entire history we've discussed today, it's this constant thread of spiritual mandate meeting political reality. The Dalai Lama institution, born from ancient myth and the spiritual vow of Avalokiteśvara, rose to temporal power through vital military and political alliances with the Khans of Mongolia.
That power was then held in a delicate, precarious balance with external patrons, first the Mongols and later the king, who saw the relationship increasingly through the lens of a vassal state. It was nearly extinguished repeatedly by internal court intrigue and the tragedy of the short-lived lamas,
which ultimately strengthened external king interference, leaving the country vulnerable.
And now, the spiritual leader of the Gelug school exists entirely in exile, transforming the role from a temporal ruler to a global moral guide, and using the remnants of his traditional authority, through the Ganden Phodrang Trust, to decide the future of his own spiritual line.
In direct defiance of the boundaries set by a modern authoritarian nation-state.
Which brings us back to the ultimate, concrete challenge facing the future. The source material tells us that the Dalai Lama is an incarnation of Avalokiteśvara, the bodhisattva who vowed to defend the Tibetan people. Given the immense political pressure exerted by the PRC to control the succession, and the 14th Dalai Lama's vow not to be reborn in a non-free country, we must ask this question.
If the next Dalai Lama is successfully located and enthroned in a volatile area like the India-Nepal-Bhutan cultural belt, how will the global community reconcile the traditional spiritual sovereignty of a bodhisattva's rebirth with the hard military reality of modern international borders?
Will the spirit of compassion survive the political geography of the 21st century? That choice is now a global concern.